Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kritik Svabalan, and I'm the co-director of the Public Policy and Global Affairs Review, which is the flagship student journalism initiative at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm incredibly grateful to welcome back an esteemed Munk alumni, Pitasanna Shanmugathas, for this special feature in PPGAR's inaugural year. Prasanna holds a Master of Global Affairs degree from the Munk School, graduating in 2021, and is currently pursuing his JD at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. He brings together a background in global affairs, law, journalism, and documentary filmmaking, with a body of work that focuses on international human rights, foreign policy, and social justice. He's the director, writer, and producer of Neelan Unsilenced, the documentary we are focusing on today. He's also the co-director of a six-part documentary series called The Truth to Powerless, an investigation into Canada's foreign policy, which examines Canada's colonial history, its role in international conflicts, and the impact of its foreign policy on communities in the global south. Beyond filmmaking, Preston has contributed to journalism through outlets such as the Sri Lankan Guardian, Truth Out, and the Colombo Telegraph, and has interviewed figures such as Noam Chomsky, Bob Rae, Vijay Prasad, Jeffrey Sachs, and UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, among others. He's also been deeply involved in refugee and human rights advocacy, working with the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture, Save the Children Canada, Stand Canada, and the Canadian Voice of Women of Peace. This afternoon, we're especially honored to discuss his film, Neelan Unsilenced, an in-depth examination of the life and work of Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam, a Sri Lankan Tamil academic, constitutional lawyer, and politician who dedicated his career to human rights, constitutional reform, and conflict resolution, and whose life was tragically cut short in 1999 after an assassination was carried out by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, a militant separatist organization that sought to create an independent Tamil state during Sri Lanka's nearly 3 decade civil war. Dr. Neelan remains a contested figure in the Tamil community. For some, his efforts to pursue a federal power-sharing solution within a united Sri Lanka were seen as a betrayal of the Tamil aspiration for an independent state. But for others, his work represents a principled and pragmatic attempt to address decades of discrimination, centralization, and violence through democratic constitutional reform, including proposals that he supported, such as the Union of Regions framework, designed to devolve power to various regions. Prasanna's documentary helps to unsilence Neelan's voice. It brings to light not only his personal history, but also the broader stakes of the Sri Lankan Civil War, questions of state violence, militancy, federalism, devolution, and what a just peace might look like. For many Tamils such as myself, Prasanna, and our fellow PPGR editors today who are joining us, this is not just an abstract history, it's intimately connected to our family's experiences, our identities, and understanding of justice and reconciliation. We're joined today by Sahana Gunaratnam, like myself, a second-year Master of Public Policy student at the Munk School, who will be taking lead in interviewing Prasanna today. We're also joined by Deepika Loganathan and Perinda Peralgan, both first-year MPP students who will be publishing a film review of Neelan Unsilenced, as well as a commentary on the history of the Sri Lankan Civil War for PPJR. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand over things to Deepika, Perinda, and Sahana to briefly introduce themselves and begin the conversation with Prasanna.
Thank you, Kritik. So I'm Deepika.
And my name is Perinda Pedalagan.
And my name
And,
is Sahana.
and as mentioned, we're MPP students and editors on the PPGAR editorial board. Um,
So watching the Neelan Unsilenced documentary really shaped how we approached our review for the PPGAR editorial submission for this month. What stood out to us was how the film brings together the history, law, and lived experiences of the Sri Lankan community to show how the Civil War didn't just come out of nowhere. It really showed the deeply rooted decades of state discrimination against Tamil peoples over the decades. Our piece specifically focused on Tiruchelvam's constitutional vision for reform and why he believed that regional rights were essential for pluralism and the conflict resolution of the Civil War. We also highlighted how the state's failure to pursue truth, reconciliation, and equitable development after the war continues to undermine the vision of Tiruchelvam still today.
Yeah, and just to continue on, our review also focuses on how systemic injustice escalated into the Civil War, from the Sinhala Only Act to the burning of the Jaffna Library and Black July. The documentary helped us understand really how government policies pushed Tamils towards separatism. We also looked at how different voices in the film, legal experts, politicians, activists, and how their contrasting perspectives show the internal debates within the Tamil community. So it's really nice to have like a variety of different perspectives. What we took away from the viewing is that his assassination symbolizes the clash between peaceful reform and militant resistance, and that Sri Lanka's post-war politics still fails to address the root causes. Um, and yeah, so now I'll just pass it on to Sahana for her thoughts and the interview.
Yeah, I was just hoping we can just get started with the interview. I think Prinda and Deepika really laid it out really well. Like the document was very interesting. Like I hadn't heard of Dr. Neelan beforehand, but I knew some of the folks who were also working within that space, like Gigi Ponambalam, SJV, as well as Prabha. So yeah, I'll start off with our first question, if that's all right. What drew you to Neelan Tiruchelvam as the focus of your documentary? You know, oftentimes we often hear about Prabha or Gigi Ponambalam, SJV, where there were opportunities to focus on other individuals within the Tamil political space and struggle. So, you know, why Dr. Chelvam?
Uh, Thank you. I should say, first of all, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Uh, I will address your latter comment first, and then I'll address your main question. I would argue Dr. Tiruchelvam was the most important Tamil figure to come out of Sri Lanka in the second half of the 20th century. Dr. Tiruchelvam is the Martin Luther King Jr. of Sri Lanka, and this isn't hyperbole. I'm being very careful with my words. There are significant similarities between the ideologies of Neelan Tiruchelvam and Martin Luther King Jr. Both Martin Luther King Jr. and Neelan Tiruchelvam spoke out against militarism and advocated for peaceful coexistence among their nation's diverse communities. And both Dr. King and Dr. Tiruchelvam were killed by their nation's diverse by their own countrymen, for that very reason. Both Dr. King and Neelan Tiruchelvam sought to work with their respective national governments to improve the welfare of their own communities. In the case of Dr. King, he worked with US President Lyndon B. Johnson to usher in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, both of which tremendously advanced the rights of Black Americans. Dr. Tiruchelvam worked with the Sri Lankan government under President Chandrika Kumaratunga to help formulate the boldest and most progressive constitutional reform proposals in the nation's history to date, which would have devolved significant power to the various regions of Sri Lanka, including the Tamil regions, and it would have provided a framework for the various pluralistic communities to coexist with equal rights. Dr. Tiruchelvam, like Dr. King, was a firm proponent of pluralism, coexistence in the early 1980s. Dr. Tiruchelvam actually created institutions in Sri Lanka, the International Center for Ethnic Studies and a Law and Society Trust. These institutions still exist to this day, and they were focused on producing scholarly research and dialogue on democracy, ethnic, religious, linguistic, cultural pluralism, the rights of minority communities, constitutional reform in diverse societies, and feminism. And this was happening in the early 1980s. So Dr. Tiruchelvam was a trailblazer for progressive thought. And Dr. Tiruchelvam also helped pioneer democratic election monitoring in the global south in countries like Chile, where Dr. Tiruchelvam oversaw Chile going from a brutal dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet to a return to democracy. And he also oversaw democratic elections in countries like Bangladesh, South Africa. And the reason is because Dr. Tiruchelvam, like Dr. King, believed that democracy is the foundation that is required for any meaningful progressive reforms to emerge that can give rights and protections to the various communities in society. And not only was Dr. Tiruchelvam advising on constitutional reform in Sri Lanka, but Dr. Tiruchelvam took his principle of the rights of minority communities in diverse societies. He took that principle abroad and also advised in the formulation of the draft constitution in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan had become a newly independent country as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, and we discuss all of these issues that Dr. Tiruchelvam was involved in the documentary with the relevant people. So for this reason, for those reasons, I would argue that Dr. Tiruchelvam, in addition to being the Martin Luther King Jr. of Sri Lanka, was the best Sri Lankan Tamil to do a documentary about. He was the most positively impactful. And one final parallel I should draw is that both Dr. King and Dr. Tiruchelvam, due to their willingness to work with their respective governments to advance the rights of their own people, were maligned as traitors by the most reactionary elements of their own communities. In the case of Dr. King, he was maligned as a traitor, more specifically an Uncle Tom, by Black people like Malcolm X. And in the case of Dr. Tiruchelvam, he was maligned as a traitor by the extreme Tamil supporters of PPGAR. Now, to address your main question as to what really compelled me to do a documentary on Dr. Tiruchelvam, Dr. Tiruchelvam, as a Sri Lankan Tamil himself, he was severely vilified during his life and even after death, particularly by segments of the Tamil community, for opposing the LTT's demand of a separate state and for articulating a viable framework in which all the diverse communities, the Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, Burghers, Indian Tamils, could coexist in peace. And this was directly antithetical to the LTT's views, and so his legacy was suppressed. So when I first came to know of Dr. Tiruchelvam, I came to know of him as a result of reading the writings of a Sri Lankan Tamil Canadian journalist by the name of D.B.S. Jayaraj. I stumbled upon one of his articles where he had talked about this man named Neelan Tiruchelvam and how he had offered this bold political solution to peacefully resolve the ethnic conflict, to end the bloodshed, and how he was vilified and killed because of that. And so reading that article, it made me curious to learn more about the proposals. And I also, around that time, stumbled on a documentary made by a Canadian filmmaker by the name of Helene Klodowski. And she made a documentary called No More Tears, Sister, about Dr. Rajani Thurnagama, who was a former member of the LTTE. She left the LTTE and she co-founded the Jaffna University Teachers for Human Rights, which was an organization that reported on the human rights abuses of the Sri Lankan government, the Indian Peacekeeping Force, and the LTTE. And because of her criticisms of the LTTE and her vocal position that there should be a democratic solution, she was shot dead by the LTTE while she was biking home from her university. And seeing that documentary and seeing how that documentary showcased Dr. Thurnagama's legacy, I wanted to do the same for Neelan Tiruchelvam. So that's what really sparked the idea. And also the reason why I released the documentary now is because Sri Lanka has a new government under President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who during his election campaign ran on a platform of abolishing the executive presidency, of devolving power from the center to the regions. Many of these promises mirrored Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals. So I wanted to release the documentary now because President Dissanayaka's government, they have a super majority in parliament, a greater than 2/3 majority. So they have the political ability to implement a bold and progressive constitution like Neelan Tiruchelvam envisioned. So for those reasons, that's why I released the documentary.
Yeah, thanks so much. Like you mentioned, for you, Dr. Neelan was Dr. Neelan was the most important Tamil political figure to come out of Sri Lanka. During your documentary process, were there any stories or anecdotes about him that surprised you during your research?
I think one thing that that I liked about Dr. Tiruchelvam is some of the people I interviewed who knew Dr. Tiruchelvam worked with him, like Vasuki Nesea. She worked with him at the International Center for Ethnic Studies as a researcher. She would talk about how Dr. Tiruchelvam had like a very playful a personality, especially with little children. Vasuki would bring her 2-3-year-old daughter to the International Center for Ethnic Studies where Neelan was working, and Neelan would have back then they had these big computers, and Neelan would have these discs that would have these nursery song, these rhymes, like the wheels on the bus go round and round, like those rhymes, and the little daughter just loved hearing those songs. So then she would ask Neelan, the daughter, for like another song, and he would go out of his way to find that song. And so it was those kind of he had this very playful, a personality when it came to kids, and he just loved kids. And and he's living surrounding himself with just so much death and suffering, but he had just this very positive and attitude. That wasn't I didn't include that in the documentary because I wanted it to focus on the more serious issues, and there's just a lot in the documentary. But I think one thing that really struck out to me about Dr. Tiruchelvam is it didn't surprise me, but it reaffirmed my beliefs in Dr. Tiruchelvam, which is that Dr. Tiruchelvam consistently was vocal about the government's atrocities against Tamil civilians. He repeatedly condemned in Parliament, as a member of Parliament, he would give speeches condemning the forced displacement of Tamil civilians by the army, the use of torture and arbitrary detention, the potential reintroduction of the death penalty, when there were revelations of a mass grave in Chemmani in 1998. In July of 1998, almost immediately, Dr. Tiruchelvam gave a speech in Parliament saying that these allegations need to be investigated. There needs to be an independent excavation and investigation into these mass graves, and he would cite international protocol in his speech about how these excavations need to be carried out credibly, with DNA evidence, impartially, and he was laying out the procedure in terms of how to really address this alleged atrocity and bring accountability to the perpetrator. So Dr. Tiruchelvam was somebody who was repeatedly speaking out about the horrendous atrocities of Tamil civilians. So Dr. Tiruchelvam is often portrayed as somebody who was a stooge of the government, but when you read his parliamentary speeches, he was vocal and insistent about atrocities against Tamil civilians. He was calling for accountability, and in more than 26 years later, when the Chemmani mass graves, these allegations turned out to be true, Dr. Tiruchelvam's words in that 1998 speech prove now to be more relevant than ever. So I think that was one of the main things that struck me about Dr. Tiruchelvam, is he was somebody who repeatedly spoke out against human rights abuses committed by all communities, and especially the human rights abuses being committed against members of his own community.
Yeah, like it was nice, like you mentioned, hearing about Dr. Neelan's, playfulness, especially in a time where, there's death and carnage surrounding him, as well as like talking about difficult topics in Parliament. During your filmmaking process, what did you learn? What were the difficult aspects of filming this documentary, whether that was speaking with family members and friends of Dr. Neelan or with other Eelam Tamil politicians and advocates?
The filmmaking process was a 9-year journey, and there was a lot to cover because Dr. Tiruchelvam, in his 55 years on this planet, he achieved a lot, from institution building, advising on constitutional reform in multiple countries, to pioneering democratic election monitoring in the global south, and emerging as a globally respected human rights figure. When he was assassinated, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, President Bill Clinton, and First Lady Hillary Clinton, they all gave condolences and spoke about the enormous, profound loss that Sri Lanka has just faced as a result of his assassination. So he was somebody that was a globally respected human rights figure in numerous circles. So there was a lot to cover, and I felt it was important to begin the documentary by grounding the documentary in Dr. Tiruchelvam's personal story, particularly highlighting the formative influences of his father, Senator Murugesan Tiruchelvam, who was a staunch advocate of federalism and advocate for the rights of the Tamil minority community during a period of significant single and majoritarian violence in the 50s and 60s. And so Neelan Tiruchelvam kind of grew up being surrounded and exposed to these atrocities, these pogroms that were happening against the minority Tamil community, and seeing his father as a member of the Tamil Federal Party being vocal in the Sri Lankan Parliament in Ceylon at that time, the Ceylon Parliament, speaking out about the rights of the minority communities, how there needs to be a political solution, and how even Senator Tiruchelvam was being maligned, being accused of falsely supporting separatism by the Sinhalese, and even faced attacks from his own Tamil community. So I decided to begin the documentary by really paralleling the documentary with the trajectory of paralleling Neelan's life with the trajectory of the Sri Lankan Civil War, its history. And you kind of see how Neelan Tiruchelvam's life and the Sri Lankan Civil War from the 50s of the Single Only Act to the riots in the late 1950s and to the pogroms. I mean, you kind of see how his life kind of paralleled that. So I thought that was the best way to go about doing it. I also did want to interview, and I did interview a very pro LTTE former member of parliament, MK Eelam, who was a staunch supporter of the LTTE and was a staunch critic of the Tiruchelvam family, both Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam and his father. And I thought it was important to have an anti-Tiruchelvam voice in the documentary to give it greater credibility and to show the diverse views. And I also was determined to include the words of Prabhakaran and the footage of Prabhakaran, and to include his voice as well, because Neelan was ultimately killed by the LTT, so you needed to have their voice. So I think in the documentary you see both sides, you see both perspectives, the very narrow separatist perspective, and also Dr. Tiruchelvam's perspective and that of his father, of a federal society where all communities can coexist, and the backlash they got for that among the Sinhalese and also among extreme elements within the Tamil community. So that's kind of how I went about the filmmaking process.
Yeah, wow to hear that it was a 9-year documentary process for you. And even I know I can't speak on for Deepika and Brinda, but like even just looking at the Tamil genocide, there were so many moving pieces. Like if something was happening in the north, there's always something happening in the south. There were just a lot of moving pieces. And even when I was watching the documentary with my dad, you mentioned Mr. MK Ilavanathan. Yeah, my dad mentioned like he came here from Canada seeking political asylum. I think he passed away a couple of years ago or like last year. So it was interesting for even when I was watching with my dad, just different diversity of thought, but also different folks who were in that space as well. And touching on the difficult aspects, when I brought up the documentary to some of my family members, they voiced their opposition to Dr. Neelan very clearly to me. They said he was someone very close to the government, and for me, the association with the Sri Lankan state is a concern, just because they were the ones behind many of the, atrocities against Tamils and even Muslims as well, and even, failed to acknowledge that or kind of, um, you know, uh, address reconciliation for Tamils. So what would you say to Eelam Tamils who don't regard Dr. Neelan in a positive light, in an elevator pitch? How would you describe Dr. Neelan and his efforts?
Dr. Tiruchelvam was somebody who repeatedly emphasized the sanctity of life. And you hear him say those words in the documentary. And those words were said in one of his final speeches to Parliament prior to his assassination. And Dr. Tiruchelvam said those words in the context of the enormous bloodshed that was being spilled during the Civil War. Tamil civilians were being slaughtered mercilessly by the Sri Lankan government, the Indian peacekeeping force, and also the LTTE was committing atrocities. They were strapping themselves with these suicide vests and blowing themselves up. So Dr. Tiruchelvam was speaking about the sanctity of life, how valuable, how precious life is within that context. So in November of 1994, where you had a politician come into office, Chandrika Kumaratunga, who was elected with 62% of the vote, with support from both the Tamil community and the Sinhalese communities, speaking publicly and saying in the most vocal and direct sense that the Tamil people do have legitimate grievances, and the direction towards militarism was a direct product of the decades of violence that the Tamil people were subjected to. Chandrika Kumaratunga would say this repeatedly. So in Chandrika Kumaratunga, Dr. Tiruchelvam saw an opportunity to work with a government that was vocally speaking about the grievances of the Tamil people as a way to peacefully end the civil war and to end the bloodshed. Dr. Tiruchelvam rightfully saw that a military solution is not an option. It's just going to end up killing and slaughtering more and more Tamils. And the only way in which you can end this war is through a peaceful political solution that would save the lives of tens of thousands of Tamils. So when a new government came into power that was speaking about the grievances of the Tamil people and saying that we want to address these grievances, Dr. Tiruchelvam, very much similar to Dr. King in the case of Lyndon B. Johnson, who became vocal about the grievances of the Black community, decided to work with their respective governments to formulate a political solution that would address the grievances of the minority communities. And the reason why the LTT assassinated him is precisely because Dr. Tiruchelvam's constitutional reform proposals offered Tamils a viable democratic framework alternative to armed separatism, and thereby it threatened the LTT's justification for continued violence and their monopoly on representing Tamil political aspirations. And in the documentary, you see a Tamil politician towards the end, Sumandran, who says that there's been so much loss and so much destruction, primarily of the Tamil people, when you compare to who has lost out more as a result of the civil war. And now Tamils are left looking towards a solution. And Dr. Tiruchelvam showed a pathway that would result in a viable democratic framework whereby all the communities could live with equal rights. And he was advocating this at the height of the Civil War, So I think the reason why Dr. Tiruchelvam is viewed negatively is precisely because he was anathema to the LGT's undemocratic dictatorial way of governing over an ethnically homogenous Tamil state. And he instead provided a viable, feasible framework where all these communities could live together.
You kind of hint at my next question. You touched upon democratic frameworks. So my question is, why was constitutional reform considered such a critical avenue for addressing the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka at the time?
Constitutional reform was and remains extremely critical to addressing the grievances of the minority communities because the current constitutional system in Sri Lanka is fundamentally centralized and majoritarian, whereby the Singla dominated community at the federal level, at the central level, they have all the power, and whatever power under the unitary system that Sri Lanka currently has, whereby powers consolidated at the center, whatever powers the unitary state gives to the regions with one hand, they can take back with the other. And given the history whereby the Tamil minority community were subject to uh, brutal acts of repression by the majority Sinhala community, to have a unitary system whereby the minority communities are repeatedly at the mercy of the majority community uh, is fundamentally unsustainable towards coexistence. So that's why Dr. Tiruchelvam saw that the only way in which communities can coexist together with equal rights is through a framework whereby power is no longer held at the center and its powers devolve to the regions, and these regions are given significant political autonomy without the ability for the central government to unilaterally take those powers away. And that's why the proposals that Dr. Tiruchelvam advocated for in 1995, the Union of Regions proposals, they were so important because in the Union of Regions proposals, it explicitly states that in Article 76 of the Sri Lankan Constitution, which entrenches the unitary state, that provision will be removed, and Sri Lanka, instead of being known as a unitary state, will be known as a union of regions, whereby power is devolved from the center to the regions, and there are exclusive spheres of legislative authority for both the center and the regions, and the powers will be devolved from the center to the regions in areas of finance, police, land, energy, transport. I mean, these are some of the most contentious issues among the majority Sinhalese and minority Tamil communities. And so the proposals Dr. Tiruchelvam advocated rectify the flaws of the unitary state, the flaws of the current Sri Lankan system, whereby power is consolidated at the center by the majority Sinhala community. And that's why Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals are so relevant. And that's why constitutional reform is so relevant, because the minority communities in their respective regions, they deserve their autonomy and their independence to govern without intrusion by the central government. And in Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals, he had these kind of checks and balances. You know, although the governors will be appointed by the president, the governors the governors can only maintain office at by having the support of the chief ministers, and the chief ministers can only be in office if they have the support of the regional councils. So at various levels, you had all these checks and balances, which would make it very difficult for the central government to come in and unilaterally take away the powers it's given to the regions. There were these checks and balances in place that would make that extremely difficult, and thereby Dr. Tiruchelvam rectified the fundamental flaws of the unitary state that was imposed by these Sinhalese nationalist governments. And these are the remedies that we need today to address the grievances of the minority communities. So that's why constitutional reform is so important, because Tamils deserve and Tamils, not only Tamils, but Muslims, Indian plantation Tamils, Burghers, these minority communities deserve their autonomy with respect to land, policing, energy. These are such critical issues, and the proposals went to immediately addressing and rectifying those issues.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about how, Dr. Neelan's, constitutional reforms is meant to address those grievances of the minority population. Given that the Sri Lankan state has repeatedly ignored, other like just basic law of not trying to kill fellow citizens, that everyone's equal under the law, and, continue to commit acts of violence against Tamils. Do you believe Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam's efforts towards constitutional reform would have been effective had he lived longer? Or were those reforms destined to fail in a political environment where the state itself disregarded the Constitution? And I think even other times where, I believe SJV had a pact with Bandaranaike, but eventually he was assassinated by a right-wing Sinhalese monk, where, any point where the Sri Lankan state tried to give a sort of inch to the Tamil people or just attempt to address those grievances, they'll have, uproar within their own party, within their community. So there was really no opportunity to address Tamil grievances by the Sri Lankan state. So, was constitutional reform a viable option if Dr. Tiruchelvam wasn't assassinated?
I think that the reason why the Dr. Tiruchelvam's efforts weren't effective is not because of the viability of the proposals, but for other reasons, two reasons. Namely, President Kumaratunga's government lacked the two-thirds majority required to enact the Constitution, to pass the constitutional reforms. Chandrika Kumaratunga needed a two-thirds majority in Parliament to implement the constitutional reform proposals, and that meant that she needed support from the opposing Sinhalese party, the United National Party, led by Ranil Wickremesinghe. And Ranil Wickremesinghe withheld his party's support for the proposals because he didn't want Chandrika Kumaratunga to have the victory of bringing to Sri Lanka a new constitution, a bold constitution that addressed the grievances of the minority communities. And it's also important to mention that the constitutional reform proposals not only did they address the grievances of the minority communities in Sri Lanka, but they also addressed the grievances of the majority Sinhalese community in their respective regions, because you have to remember the way that the unitary system is structured is power is consolidated at the center, and whatever powers are devolved from the center to the regions, including the Sinhalese regions, with one hand could be taken away with the other. So the Sinhala chief ministers were vocal in saying that under this unitary system, we don't have any power because we're at the mercy of the executive president of the unitary state. So if an executive president comes into office who is against our political views, they could just unilaterally take away those powers from the Sinhala regions as well. So what Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals did is that they advocated for preventing the central government from unilaterally taking away powers not only to the Tamil regions, but also to the Sinhalese regions, and thereby giving the Sinhalese politicians, chief ministers, and Tamil chief ministers a significant degree of autonomy to govern. And so the reason why the UNP opposed the proposals was not because of their devolutionary powers. They actually supported that. The reason why they opposed it is because of the classic Sinhalese party rivalry, whereby if one party is advocating for something positive, the other party has to sabotage it. And the second reason why Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals failed is because of Prabhakaran's fundamental unwillingness to consider any solution alternative to that of a separate state. When those proposals, when Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals that he worked on, when they were publicly released by the government on August 3rd, 1995, you had over 100 scholars, academics, Tamil and Sinhalese praising these proposals, saying that they were a bold framework, they were federalism in all but name. So Prabhakaran was extremely fearful because here, for the first time, you had a genuine Sri Lankan government that had, in substance, given the most bold proposals advocating for addressing the grievances of the minority communities. And so when the proposals were released, Prabhakaran was silent. He did not want to engage with those proposals at all, because it was a threat to Prabhakaran's vision of an ethnically homogenous Tamil state. And the reason why I say ethnically homogenous is because under Prabhakaran's dictatorial rule, Prabhakaran had ethnically cleansed the north of the country of the Muslims. In 1990, more than 70,000 Muslims were ethnically cleansed. Within a matter of 72 hours, the Prabhakaran carried out the Kutankoti Mosque massacre in the east of the country, killing over 140 men while they were praying in the mosque, shooting up the mosque while they were praying. Men and boys were killed. So Prabhakaran wanted to create an ethnically homogenous Tamil state, and Dr. Tiruchelvam's proposals, which advocated a feasible manner in which all these communities can coexist, Tamils, Muslims, Sinhalese, with equal rights and protections, fundamentally dismantling the racist unitary structure of the Sri Lankan state was anathema to Prabhakaran. And that's why Prabhakaran had to kill Neelan Tiruchelvam, because he was a threat to that undermined his goal to achieve this separate state. I mean, you also have to look at where when Tamil politicians were advocating for unity among these other Tamil groups in 1989, when V. Yogiswaran and Appapille Mirthalingam and Siva Sitamparam, these are three Tamil democratically elected politicians under the Tamil United Liberation Front. They were approached by the LTTE and they were the LTT was expressing an interest in addressing the grievances that we have, and let's form a united political front. We need to address our grievances. So the LTTE went to the residency, the residence apartment, the housing complex of the Tamil United Liberation Front, where V. Yogiswaran, Appapille Mirthalingam, and Siva Sitamparam, they were there, and the LTT met them and immediately shot them dead in cold blood. V. Yogiswaran was killed by the LTT in cold blood at that meeting, Appapille Mirthalingam. And the reason why is because the LTT did not want to have any diverse political viewpoints within the Tamil community that went against their own in terms of advocating for a separate state. V. Yogiswaran, Appapille Mirthalingam, and Siva Sitamparam, they were advocating for a way in which the grievances of the Tamil community could be addressed under a united Sri Lanka. And this was anathema to Prabhakaran. So Prabhakaran was bent on stifling any voice that was against his vision of a separate, ethnically homogenous state. And for that reason, Dr. Tiruchelvam had to be killed. So I think it wasn't the viability of the proposals, but because of these two fundamental obstacles of the UNP's opposition and Prabhakaran's unwillingness, that ultimately resulted in the proposals being a failure.
Yeah, you mentioned unity, despite it being only, a five-letter word, both within, the Tamil community and that political military space, as well as in Parliament, with the UNP and Ranil Wickremesinghe. It's funny hearing his name just because, he's been in government, I feel like, for so long. Even Black July, he was a minister. He was only recently, I believe, arrested. I think he was sent to a hospital because for care, but for corruption reasons, by this new government. It's just interesting to see how, the same kind of folks within that space are continuing to be detrimental for any opportunity of peace or, cooperation. My last question is, why should Eelam Tamils, particularly younger generations who may not know, Dr. Neelan, Gigi Ponambalam, SJV, like that, other folks working within that Tamil political space, other than Prabhakaran, what impact do you hope your documentary has on audiences?
I hope that the younger generation of Sri Lankan Tamils, I hope that they're able to look at this documentary and see that Dr. Tiruchelvam's vision represents the most credible and viable pathway forward for achieving the rights of the Tamil minority community within a realistic political framework. And the LTTE's vision of a separate state was fundamentally unworkable because it was a dictatorial state that ultimately sought to not give representation to the minority communities, but sought to solely enforce their narrow view of a ethnically homogenous state whereby Muslims were excluded, Indian plantation Tamils could not have voices, the Sinhalese couldn't have voices. So, and throughout the entire 30-year civil war, with so much enormous bloodshed, you didn't have a single government, a single country in the world that recognized the support that recognized the Tamil separate state. There was no single country in the world that recognized a Tamil separate state. So every country advocated for the grievances of the Tamil people to be addressed under a united Sri Lanka, whereby the central government is not majoritarian and stifling the regional government's voice and autonomy. And Dr. Tiruchelvam's political framework is the most progressive and viable way in which the uh, aspirations of the minority communities can be realized. And I would also encourage Sri Lankan Tamils to see that the Civil War was not a black and white issue. It wasn't that the Sri Lankan government were the monsters, the blood lust perpetrators of atrocities, and the LTTE were the liberators. It wasn't black and white. What really happened is that the Sri Lankan government did commit massive atrocities against the Tamil community, especially at the end of the war in 2009. But the LTTE also did commit atrocities. So you have to, if you're Sri Lankan Tamil and you claim to advocate for the rights of Tamils, well, then you have to speak out about the rights of Tamils when there are violations against them being committed, regardless of who commits them. If it's committed by the Sri Lankan government, you have to speak out about it. And if it's also committed by the LTTE, you have to speak out about it. The LTTE eliminated the political leaders of rival Tamil groups like Plot and EPR Tilo, and they undemocratically appointed themselves after killing these leaders as the sole representative of the Tamil speaking people. So the LTTE operated in a dictatorial manner whereby any Tamil like Neelan Tiruchelvam, Rajani Thirunagama, Appapule Mirthalingam, V. Yogiswaran, even his wife, V. Yogiswaran's wife, was killed when nearly 10 years later, she was democratically elected as the mayor of Jaffna. She was assassinated by the LTTE. So the LTTE was a group that was dictatorial and was not interested in a framework in which communities could coexist in peace, but was solely determined to sustain its ethnically homogenous Tamil state. So you have to speak out about the LTT's atrocities as well. If you're a Sri Lankan Tamil and you claim to care about Tamil rights, you have to speak about the LTT's atrocities as well as the Sri Lankan government. So I think that is the main thing I would like for Tamils to take away, is that through this documentary, it shows a framework, a realistic framework, a bold framework in which all these communities could coexist together. And now Sri Lanka has a new government under President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, which is outside of the traditional two-party system, the Sri Lankan Freedom Party and the United National Party. Outside of that framework, it's a third party that for the first time in Sri Lanka's modern history is the governing party with a super majority in parliament, a greater than two-thirds majority. And President Dissanayake, during his election campaign, ran on a platform of abolishing the executive presidency, of a new constitution that would give power, devolve power from the center to the regions. So you have a president that's was vocally elected with support from both the Tamil and the Sinhalese community with an enormous supermajority. Now there's a real option to bring forward a new constitution for Sri Lanka that emulates the democratic framework that Dr. Tiruchelvam envisioned. So young Tamil, Sri Lankan Tamils should vocally call on the Dissanayake government to implement the proposals that Dr. Tiruchelvam had helped formulate, and put pressure on this government to genuinely address the grievances of the minority communities. I hope that is a significant takeaway that young Tamils have watching this documentary.
Yeah, I appreciate you touching on how it's never a black and white issue. There's always, a bit of gray, and there's so many moving parts. And, thanks for so much for, joining us for this interview, but also highlighting the future, but also the present as well. Despite, Dr. Neelan's efforts and his death, there's something that, younger Tamils can look forward to or look to in the future and present. I'll pass it back to Karthik.
Yes, like Sahana said, we really enjoyed that conversation. I think as someone whose own family history is tied to this conflict, I found myself learning new things about not just Dr. Neelan, but about more of the political efforts behind the war. As someone who's always focused, say, on the military side of the conflict, I never really looked at, you know, the constitutional efforts, the legal efforts of so many different academics and scholars who tried to take a different avenue. And I think another value with this documentary, I think there's a lot to learn from the different visions people have when it comes to ethnic tensions. Um, you know, these can be addressed through institutions. It can be addressed through power sharing and sustained commitment to justice, the way Dr. Neelan envisioned. But there also is a place to reflect on whether or not there is value in military resistance. For all the flaws of the Tamil Tigers, as you mentioned, their ethnic politics, their war crimes, it still forces us to consider whether or not militant resistance as a whole has any kind of place in conflict resolution. Um, but that was sort of my takeaway from this documentary. Again, as you mentioned, as Sahana mentioned, it's never black and white. Constitutional reform is always the preferred option because it is the most peaceful option, but there's also instances where militant resistance might be necessary. But regardless, I think militant resistance has sort of been the dominant focal point in discussions about the war. And I do think a lot of Tamil people embrace resistance. But I think what this documentary does is, like you said, it introduces a new lens into how we can resolve conflicts. And I think this is a discussion that can also be taken into other conflicts around the world, where we see this clash between resistance and the more political constitutional efforts by academics and scholars. So,
I think, I think you made a great point. I just want to touch on that briefly, if I can. I think in the Sri Lankan context, it was perfectly legitimate for Tamils to take up arms. It was perfectly legitimate because Sri Lanka was a country off of the coast of the Indian Ocean, and when these bloody pogroms were happening in the 50s and the 70s, uh, the the international community was not paying any attention to it. There was no attention being given to the Tamils who were being massacred in these pogroms by the Sinhala-dominated government. And so a credible argument could be made that armed struggle was a way in which the grievances of the Tamil minority communities uh, could have received international attention and thereby forcing the Sri Lankan government to address the grievances of the community. So, in that respect, you can argue that armed struggle was a rational move on the part of the minority Tamil community who were disregarded in the international arena. The slaughters were never covered by in any significant depth by the international media. But where there's a problem is once you had a government that came into power that recognized the grievances of the Tamil minority community, such as the Chandrika Kumaratunga government, and they recognized them in substance by advocating for the boldest and most progressive reforms to address the grievances of the minority community. At that point, that should have compelled Prabhakaran to say, now we have significantly achieved one of our main goals of the armed struggle, which is to compel a Sri Lankan government to legitimately address our grievances. And now we need to seriously consider a way in which we can come to an agreement with this government to lay down our arms and to implement this political framework. That should have been the option Prabhakaran chose. But what Prabhakaran did is he was silent when the President Kumartun government advocated for these proposals, and then he ended up killing the main author of the proposals, Neelan Tiruchelvam, precisely because he advocated for a way in which the minority communities and all the communities on the island could coexist together in peace. So Prabhakaran was not using the armed struggle as a way to address the grievances of the minority communities, but he was using the armed struggle in a dictatorial way where he eliminated democratically elected Tamil politicians and sought to create a dictatorship whereby it's one man rule, it's an ethnically homogenous state, and that's where the Tamil struggle failed. So yes, there is significant rationale that can be given for the Tamils' decision to take up arms in 1976 as a result of the Vadakota resolution, but that significantly failed when you finally had a government that was credibly putting forward substantive proposals addressing the grievances of the minority communities, and Prabhakaran decided to kill one of its main authors and tried to kill President Kumartunga as well in December 1999. So Prabhakaran was not concerned about addressing the grievances of the minority communities, but he was concerned about sustaining his dictatorial rule.
Mhm. That is a fair point. And I think that's sort of the story that a lot of militant resistant movements take is that they start with a genuine, rational approach because there seems to be no other avenue to address their grievances. But then when there is that opportunity, they still continue to see the issue in black and white terms. And so they see militant resistance as the only option and they kind of refuse to use any other avenue. So I think that's something that really is relevant for discussions for countries around the world. Yeah. Um, I just before we conclude, I just wanted to see Sahana, Deepika, and Prinda if you had any closing comments or reflections on not just the documentary, but the conversation that we had today.
I can just touch upon, the efforts that we see even in Canada, Ontario, like
Mhm.
we see like lobby organizations that are kind of mirroring what Tiruchelvam tried to do. So there's organizations like the National, I think, Council of Canadian Tamils that go to the UN Assembly and try to advocate for, peaceful solutions that were once introduced by Neelan Tiruchelvam. And we also see, minor changes that our community does, like the Tamil Genocide Monument. I don't know if you've all been there, but I went there with my family, and it's things like that where we separate ourselves from like the war crimes and the military movements, and we focus on like what actually happened to the Tamil community and what we can do in the future in a way that's not focused on violence and more peaceful contributions. I'll pass it on to Deepika if she has anything else to add.
Yeah, I think you worded it perfectly. I think it's just important to like understand the history. So I had a great time like watching this documentary to learn about it and learn about Neelan because I didn't know who he was before this. So um it's definitely enlightening to see like the different perspectives because growing up like under the influence of our family, we kind of just see the militant resistant group as like the right side, I guess. So it's really informative to see like the government, the constitutional reform side and how they had some of their flaws on both sides as well.
All right. Well, again, on behalf of Public Policy and Global Affairs Review, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you again, Prasanna, for taking the time to speak with us, sharing your thoughts, and for the work that you've done in bringing Neelan's story and the broader history of the Sri Lankan Civil War to a wider audience. And I also want to extend a sincere thank you to Sahana, Deepika, and Parinda for their careful work and engagement with the film and for the pieces that they'll be publishing with PPGAR. And finally, thank you to everyone who's taken the time to listen in to our conversation. We hope this encourages you to watch Neelan Unsilenced and to reflect on the legacies of the conflict and to continue thinking about what justice, pluralism, and constitutional change can look like in practice. And with that, we'll wrap it up here. Again, thank you so much for everyone joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.